morning, everyone. Sorry if you get tired of my face. I've been standing in for a couple of the readers, but I love doing it. Yes, as Philip said, our reading today is from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 19. And the reading is entitled, Abraham Tested. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld him from your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Thanks be to God for these words.
You know, as we read the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, we find something of ourselves in their struggles. In fact, it's almost as if the patriarchs somehow are the archetype of ourselves. But the funny thing is, it's the same for Jewish history. And when I speak of Jewish history, I mean from Abraham all the way up to the present. Somehow we find in those stories something of the history of the Jews in all of them. We find it. In Jacob, we find the Jews' constant struggle with God. And it still goes on today. In Joseph, we find a story of a forced exile. And there was an exile in Jewish history. But after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, almost all the Jews were forced into exile, and they're still in exile. The story of Joseph is a story of how to survive and prosper in exile. The story of Isaac is the story of a Holocaust. We don't think of it that way. I'm not sharing the story from Abraham's perspective today, but Isaac's. It's fascinating that that moment in Jewish history during the Second World War, when they were interned in those concentration camps, when they were gassed and in the ovens, they were cremated. It's funny that the Jews call that moment the Holocaust. And the actual Jewish word for a Holocaust, or the actual meaning of the Holocaust, is a burnt sacrifice to God. Now ask yourself the question, why would the Jews call that period the burnt sacrifice of their people to God? Ask yourself that question. It's a pretty big one. Same word. Now Abraham believes he's commanded by God to offer his son Isaac, his only son that he and Sarah had been blessed with, as a holocaust, as a burnt sacrifice on a mountain. Mount Moriah, that's what it's called. Now, I find this story really difficult. I'm not sure whether Abraham actually understood exactly what God was saying or misunderstood him or whatever else. But in any case, Abraham in faith goes up to Mount Moriah with Isaac, believing that this God who abhors murder and human sacrifice, believing that somehow this God who's asking him to do it, to do what God abhors, that somehow God will save him from it. He goes up believing that he's being obedient to God, but God won't push him to the edge because God abhors infant sacrifice. And in fact, one of the theories about the story, theological theories, is that it's there in the Bible, in fact, to say that God does abhor and will not allow infant sacrifice because infant sacrifice was happening in the land that Abraham lived. So he walks this road. He trusts God will kind of bail him out. And he walks that road alone with Isaac. And when we read the story, there's no conversation between Isaac and Abraham. It's a road, a journey in silence between father and son. Isaac didn't initiate any conversation. Children in Jewish families didn't do that at the time. Well, I think Abraham would have preferred silence in any case. He'd rather not talk about anything. And so they walk. And Isaac's there. Isaac doesn't know what God has told his father. Isaac doesn't know this could be his last journey in life. He doesn't know that. And on the third day, they see Mount Moriah in the distance, and Abraham says to the servants, he says, stay here with the donkeys, the boys and I are going over there to worship and we'll come back. And Abraham and Isaac walk alone up the mountain. He makes Isaac carry the wood. Abraham does that. Isaac carries the wood upon which the altar is going to be built and the sacrifice offered. You begin to understand why the Jews called Auschwitz a Holocaust. Now, Isaac doesn't know what is happening here because there's no animal to sacrifice. And against all his customs, Isaac breaks the custom of silence and the tradition. He says, Father, I see that you have the coals in the wood, but where's the lamb to be sacrificed? His father says, God will provide. And I think Isaac begins to realize maybe he is the sacrifice. Maybe he is. So we don't know what happens in that journey. We're not told. When the Bible doesn't tell you something, it's kind of a license to use your imagination quite a bit. But we're not told. And so they arrive at this place, and Abraham builds the altar, and he places the wood on the fire, and he binds his only son, Isaac, to the altar. Now I wonder what Isaac thought then. The word the Jews use for this moment, this binding, to describe this moment, the Jewish word is a binding. That's what it literally means. And so Abraham binds Isaac to this altar, and he takes up a knife to offer the sacrifice. Now imagine if you were Isaac. Hey? What would Isaac be thinking? What would Isaac be praying? I'm telling the story from Isaac's perspective. Where would he have been at that moment? And as Abraham takes up that knife in his hand over the bound Isaac, an angel steps in. At that moment. Why the angel has to wait so long, heaven alone knows. But, yeah. And the angel says to him, don't hurt that boy. And Abraham looks around and he sees the ram in the bush and he sacrifices it. Afterwards, they walk back and we know nothing about their journey whatsoever back home. Nothing's told to us. I am pretty sure father and son didn't do much talking. I really am sure about that one. I don't think there's much either of them wanted to say to each other. But we read afterwards that Abraham goes back to his servants, they go to Sheba, and they settle there. But there's no mention of Isaac. Eli Wiesel was a Jewish author, poet. He's a Nobel Peace Laureate. He survived the Nazi death camps. His sister and his mother went to the gas chambers. And he said that Isaac, of all the biblical characters, was his favorite. Because in Isaac, that young Isaac, he could see himself most profoundly when he was young in a concentration camp. When his mother and his sister were Holocaust victims. And he says from that moment, Isaac had to have scars that would never quite heal, but he had to learn to live with. He would always be, always, a Holocaust survivor. And there are Jews I know who were Holocaust survivors. You could see the scars. You could always see them. So when we look at Abraham and the purpose of the Abraham stories, you know, it's funny that in Jewish, Muslim, and Christian faith, Abraham is a man of great faith. He's a role model for Jews, Muslims, and Christians of what a great man of God should be. Jacob, later, was a model of a man who struggled with God and transformed. But Isaac is a model of a survivor. One who survived a Holocaust. And there's scars there, you know. When you look into the story of Isaac, and you start reading it, you can see that incident scarred him so profoundly. You can see in his reactions and what he does, you can see the scars in the story. But we can also see that there's something of a man who looked at death in its eyes and experienced the God who plucked him out of it. You can see that. He looked death in those eyes. He saw it in that knife in his father's hands. He saw death. And he knew he had survived it. He's no longer cowed by death. He's no longer cowed by life. There's this incredible faith in him. We see it in how he comes to marry Rebekah. We see it when his wife later betrays him and passes his blessing on to Jacob and not his firstborn son Esau. We see that incredible realization that for all that life could throw at him, he would survive. Because he had already survived the worst. And so Isaac goes and he settles in his father's land. He marries, he has children. He has hardships in his life. He experiences all that. But of all the patriarchs, in spite of almost being this Holocaust victim, in spite of being the survivor of one who looked death in his eyes, Isaac is the most settled of them all. Isaac is the most solid character of them all. There's something about him that is solid, that is strong. He doesn't do the stupid things the rest do. He's grounded as a human being. He survives the Holocaust. Grounded and solid and stable. For all the scars of it, that is who he is. Two interesting last asides on it. The funny thing is Isaac's name, he was named when his mother laughed at the angels who said she would have a child, she laughed at them. Isaac means the one who laughed. I think that's significant. Because your name defines who you are. So for all his experience being a survivor of a Holocaust, Abraham's name is the one who laughed. He had learned to laugh again. He had learned to enjoy life. He had learned to make the most of it. He had learned to laugh in spite of the scars, in spite of what he went through. So there's a second aside. That place where Abraham offered Isaac up as a sacrifice, that place, Mount Moriah, it's interesting and profoundly significant that at the place where Isaac stared death in the eye and survived, that mountain became the mountain on which the temple was built. Hey? That is where it's built. Mount Moriah. It's significant in a strange way that today on Mount Moriah is the second greatest temple in Islam. And it's significant that we believe that one day the Lord will appear to save all the nations on Mount Moriah. That's what the Jews and us believe. Isn't that interesting? Amen.